Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our second day of the festival Dando Vida a la Muerte. Today, on the 30th of October, it is our privilege and pleasure to have a really exciting day for you all. At the moment, we have the pleasure and privilege of being accompanied by Dr. Sunita Puri. And following Sunita in this international part of the festival, we will then have Dr. Emilio Herrera, followed with Vicente from Meta Hospice and Izaskun from Bedegin in Guipúzcoa. But at this moment in time, I think we are here to enjoy the company of Sunita all the way from, I think, California, if I'm not mistaken, from California, and to present Sunita to you all. She is the incoming director of the Hospice and Palliative Medicine Fellowship at the University of Massachusetts Memorial Medical Center and the School of Medicine, where she is an associate professor of clinical medicine. She is the former medical director of the Palliative Medicine Service at Keck Hospital and Norris Cancer Center of the University of Southern California, where she also served as chair of ethics of the ethics committee. Sunita, which is actually a really beautiful thing, because when you look at her webpage, she also describes herself, actually before she describes herself as a doctor, she describes herself as an author, as a writer of memoir and of nonfiction. And she has written the most beautiful book called That Good Night, Life and Medicine in the 11th Hour. This book has been critically acclaimed, examining her journey of the practice of palliative medicine and her quest to help patients and family redefine what it means to live and die well in the face of serious illness, something that I think we could all benefit from. Her book has received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Kirkus, which called it a profound meditation on a problem many of us will face in our lives, and worthy being mentioned in the same breath as Otwal Gawandi's Being Mortal. Sunita received writing residencies at the Yaddo Corporation, McDowell Colony, etc. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Slate, and JAMA. In 2018, she was awarded the Etz Chaim Tree of Life Award from the USC School of Medicine, awarded annually to a member of the faculty who, in the eyes of the campus community, models and provides humanistic and compassionate care. She and her work have been featured in the Atlantic, NPR, PBS, Christian, Amanpour Show, People Magazine, The Guardian, and India Today, among many other outlets. Sunita, you see her through the screen. I've just met her. I can't imagine how she has done all of that in such a short life. If you look at her webpage, as I have done, one of the most beautiful things that I think when she talks about who she is, she talks about one of the worries that she has is how to take, when it's the right time to take the avocados off the tree. SCK. Thank you, Sunita, for being here. I mean, after reading all of that, it's an absolute privilege to have you. And we are here to share what you feel is important to be shared, what you feel is important that people can hear and need to learn, to be able to accompany those who are at the last part of their lives, whether in infancy, in adulthood, or in old age, and why you have decided to dedicate your life. And I must say, you've done quite a lot in a very short space of time to accompany people at the end of their lives. So I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be speaking with you and with the audience. And thank you for the generous introduction. So I think one of the things we were chatting about before the interview was just why I came into this field. And I thought I might start actually by defining what palliative medicine is, because it's something that I have to do on a daily basis with my patients and their families, but also with other physicians and other clinicians. And I think the term palliative care can be very scary sounding, especially if you don't know what the word palliative means. So palliative care is a subspecialty of medicine or an approach to medicine that really emphasizes alleviating suffering. And suffering when you're very sick, be it from cancer or from being in the ICU after a car accident, there's multiple domains of suffering, including the physical pain, the emotional pain, and the spiritual and existential pain. So questions like, why would God put me in this? Or what is my purpose now that I have this cancer and work has been a big part of my life's purpose and I can't work anymore? So it's going beyond the medical model of looking just at the body and looking and encompassing and believing the body and the soul have a very profound interaction. And so the way I kind of explain this to my patients is that I'm a palliative care physician. And what that means is I'm here to help with your overall quality of life. And we can talk about what that means in terms of how you inhabit your body, where the pain or the nausea or the shortness of breath is. But we can also talk about the magnitude of this illness on your life and what you would want for yourself as the illness progresses. And I think that people confuse palliative care with hospice. Hospice is a type of palliative care that we provide in the US in the last 6 months of life. Palliative care is, as I discussed, really alleviation of suffering and focusing on quality of life. But you can get palliative care right alongside other interventions. So you might be in the ICU, very sick, and we're not sure if we can extubate you, something that happened a lot during COVID. But we can still be supporting you and treating your suffering even alongside the ICU interventions or alongside the chemotherapy or alongside the dialysis. So you don't have to make a choice between getting treatment and your quality of life. And I think that's something that's really, really important to understand. And so what I wrote about in my book was kind of how I came from a family that was very, very spiritual. Both my parents are immigrants from India. And I grew up in a home, they're both scientists. My mom's a physician, my dad's an engineer, but they both had a really strong reverence for God. And so I was brought up thinking that science and spirituality can be complementary rather than oppositional. And I think in the world of medicine, we are primed from the beginning in medical school to focus on length of life. What can we do to save you, to help you survive? And when I entered medical school, there was really no discussion of the other human elements of going through disease, even if that disease is curable. And so in my rotations, when I was in residency, part of what I wrote about was how I would have patients like a gentleman who came in for hip surgery and ended up having a very complicated post-operative course. We had respiratory failure. His kidneys started to fail. And I remember putting him on a ventilator, intubating him, putting access lines into big veins, like the veins in your neck, to get to the heart and give you powerful medicine. And yet I just saw him declining. And I felt so guilty for doing these things to him when I didn't know that these things were doing anything for him. And we weren't really talking with his family, which was his wife and son, about what it meant that he needed all these interventions and what it meant that he only needed more and more life support. Because the more you need, the sicker you are. And we weren't spelling that out for the family in a way that could allow them to make the best informed decisions for him, because he was intubated and sedated, so he couldn't participate. And I just remember being awed by the ICU, and I really wanted to practice ICU medicine. But the reason I loved it was because of the conversations and because of helping people understand what they were going through, treating their pain so they could have better days, and really using language precisely to help people really understand what was going on for them so they could make informed choices. We say a lot of things in medicine like this cancer is treatable, but treatable doesn't mean curable all the time. And that's where I think we lapse in these discussions, because people might go through a lot of pain and harsh treatment if they think they can be cured of a cancer. But would they make the same decisions if instead of treatable, we said, this is not something that we can cure? The cancer is something you will live with for the rest of your life. The goal of chemotherapy, though, is to try to hold it in place and prevent it from growing. And in that way, we hope the chemotherapy will improve your quality of life. And when it starts not to do that, we should have a discussion about what's most important to you as you walk this path. And it's really kind of using kitchen table language to help people understand in non-medical terms the profundity of what they're going through. And I was extremely drawn to how you have those conversations, how you craft the language that you use with families. And I think a lot of that came from me being a writer at heart, that I was very drawn to what was said to patients and what was left unsaid. And I think that is part of why I ended up in this field. And the joy that I feel helping people to die well and to live well as they're dying is a really deep joy that comes from knowing that someone suffering as they're dying is going to be my suffering in some form or another. So this is trying to walk people to the riverbank and help them to walk rather than crawl, or rather than being wheeled there, and trying to give them the best send-off possible. And a lot of people think that my work is really depressing. And you know what? Sometimes it is, to be very honest about that. It's really hard, and it's been hard over the last 2 years with the pandemic. But it is also, it has given me such a sense of purpose and such a sense of wanting to really heal people as they're dying. And so I think giving people good palliative care is one of the most humane and human things that our profession can do.
As you say, you are a writer, and I think when I read from you were 5 years old, you've been writing, So your language is beautiful. Listening to you, your language is very beautiful. Do you think, in your experience, because as you say, the language has to be very carefully picked, it has to be precise so people understand what is exactly happening. In your experience, are people prepared, or when they reach palliative care, when they reach you, when you walk into that room to the families, or have they asked to see the palliative care specialist, or they've been referred to the palliative care specialist, and those first moments?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think in my experience, most people have not been properly introduced to what palliative care is. And so when I walk in the room, the first thing I really have to do is get a sense of the space and what dynamics, and I hate to use this word because people might think I'm just a hippie, but I'm going to use it anyway, the energy that's in the room. And you learn as you go through your career to really focus on that first. What is the scene in the room, right? And in my experience, I would say some people have been prepared because they have either seen someone in their life die badly or die well, and they have it in their mind, I don't want to die on a ventilator in the ICU because I saw my mother or my grandfather die that way, and that's not what I want for myself. Other people have been prepared to tell me they want to fight till the end. And so it's a kind of a building of a relationship. And in that first meeting, I may focus only on the very basics, like, how are you feeling? Can I offer you something for the shortness of breath? Can I examine you? And then I try to get a sense of how much I can move into the harder conversation. And it's almost like when you're practicing surgery, you get a CT scan before you go into the abdomen, right? But once you're in there, you don't always know what you're going to find. And so that's kind of the analogy I use when I think about walking into a room, introducing myself, and then getting a sense of whether people are wary or whether people are more relaxed after I just tell them what I'm there to do. And I think a lot of that also involves pulling up a chair and sitting next to them, being very gentle with your tone of voice and your body language, and reassuring them that it's okay if you're afraid that I'm here. But I am here because I and the other physicians don't want you to be suffering as you go through this. And that's what we can talk about. But it doesn't mean that you're dying right now. It doesn't mean that other treatments are stopping. It just means that you get one other person looking out for you using a different lens.
I think you said there a couple of things, and one of the things was in the language that we have around palliative care, around illness, is that the language that people use this word fight, no? And I think that in my own experience, there's two parts: fight to live or fight to die in the process. So and it's a language, for example, families say, let's fight this cancer, or you can fight these symptoms. How, in your experience and how in your sense, does that affect people who should be receiving palliative care or who are receiving palliative care?
Yeah, just such a great question, because I do think that word, I'm a fighter, I want everything done, I'm awaiting a miracle. When I teach my students and residents and even my colleagues, those are the three big words that people get stuck with. Also, God. A lot of physicians get very afraid when God comes up, and it often does. So, with the word fighter, I think that what I try to do is acknowledge that this is the language that people feel the most comfortable with, or the language that they've heard. It's the language circulating in all of our cultures, the kind of, I'm not a quitter, I'm not going to give up. We hear it in movies, so it's reinforced in a lot of ways. And what I try to do is help people explain to me what it means to be a fighter, and also what they're fighting for. Because when you try to kind of excavate what's below the word, that's where you get what people are really trying to say. So when people tell me, I want everything done because I'm a fighter, I try to ask them first what they understand about their disease. Because if you're a fighter, you need to know the battleground, right? And you need to understand what weapons are available to you and what are not. And sometimes I will extend this metaphor so that people can really try to get into what they're actually feeling and saying, instead of using a word that's become a catchphrase that really doesn't mean anything to me. And so sometimes people tell me that they're fighting to live as long as they can because their daughter's getting married in a few months. And I might know, because of how sick they are, that is highly unlikely. And so I kind of will talk to people who are saying this and say things like, help me understand, what can we fight for something slightly different? which is you feeling the best you can. Because if you're feeling well, you will inhabit your life as you want to, regardless of whether chemotherapy continues or not. And I hear you. I hear you that you want to see your daughter get married. I see the pain that the uncertainty is bringing. And so you kind of affirm that, of course, she wants to see her daughter get married. And you kind of gently help people explain what they mean, but also to help them break down even like the word, I want to do everything. What does that mean to you? And what if we're doing everything and you are still dying? And you kind of have to build to those moments. But I think it's all about really trying to get people to say what they really mean. And that's, I think it's a very hard conversation to have. Some people will be open to it, and some people will just keep telling you, I'm a fighter and I don't want to talk about it anymore. And then you kind of have to say to them, I understand, I hear you. I also want to help you anticipate and prepare for what might come that might not be what you're fighting for. Because there's a lot of uncertainty going on now and in your future. And I want to help you prepare for all possible outcomes, including the possibility that you will get to the wedding. And so there's a way to affirm that the hope of that is really profound and means something. And also a way to hold the fact that we might need to hope for something else.
Thank you. That was so beautiful. And do you think that people, you're obviously so prepared to do this, but do you think that people, medical profession, nurses, doctors, and I would even go in as far as saying other practitioners, psychologists, but I even go as far then here, I'm going to bring in the families and the friends. Are we prepared to have, as you suggest, these meaningful conversations that allow for the person to be able to express what they need to express?
So do you mean, are the healthcare professionals prepared or are the families prepared?
Is anybody prepared? Is anybody prepared?
So I think the word prepared is an interesting one, because when we're thinking about our mortality or what we want for ourselves or what our life has meant, I think that preparation comes and goes. It's a very dynamic sort of feeling. I hear this a lot from my fellow doctors who say things like, she's not prepared, she's not ready to die. And I always kind of wonder what that means and whether being ready to die has anything to do with what's coming. And it's a very human impulse. I'm not ready, but what does being ready look like? Or what does being ready look like? And what does it look like to not be ready? And so that's kind of a point where I will challenge a little bit when my colleagues say she's not ready. But what would being ready look like? And I think the same thing about preparation, that we have moments where we can be brave, and some people can sustain that and really talk about these issues, and other people are going to fluctuate. And some people will not go there. And I think that's the other thing that I have had to accept in my work, is that I cannot make anybody prepared. That's kind of an inside job, but I can be there to help them try to get there and help them understand what being prepared would look like, either to die or to have these conversations. I also tell people that having the conversations, it's not usually a one-time one and done. It's an opening. It's an opening into something much bigger. And when you're going into, let's say, the entrance of a park, that's kind of the first conversation. And then you're meandering and you come back out where you started. And I think helping people, assuring people that this is not, I do not expect you to have these answers right now, unless it's a real emergency. And I think, affirming that being ready for anything, we might feel it in one moment and it's gone the next. And being able to hold that for people and help them hold it for themselves, I think is really part of what preparation or how we interpret being ready means.
Whenever we talk about death and dying, and we ask people very often in spaces, how would you like to die? People say, for myself, I would like a sudden death, without thinking about what they leave behind. And you describe, where I've read bits and pieces, or I've listened to bits and pieces of your work, you describe, I say the sudden death, and then you describe, rather than this death that is slow and unfolding. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I think that's very, very beautiful way of, and then also the part where you talk about managing to live, not incrementally dying. They're two things that I've heard you say, and I think very, very beautiful way of expressing.
Yeah. So the first phrase, remind me, the first one that you said.
The death, the unfolding of the experience, I think, rather than a sudden death, where death with illness is very often a slow process, and it's an unfolding.
Yeah. I think, all of us, or many of us, not maybe everybody, kind of say, I'd really just like to die in my sleep and have it be quick and painless. And the reality is that for some people that happens, but when you're dealing with an illness like, for example, end-stage cancer, end-stage liver failure, and cirrhosis, it kind of takes an incremental toll on your life. And I think part of what that slow unfolding does is there's a special sort of agony that comes with that. That comes from God taking you in pieces. And so you might lose your ability to walk without assistance. You might lose your appetite, which often happens. And you might be someone who loved food and you just can't stand the look of it anymore. It might be the fact that, at some level spiritually, you're not ready to go. And so your body kind of shuts down of its own accord, at its own pace. And I think what's really hard is that people really need to see it as you're still living as you're dying, but the point is that you're still here. And it's really filled with suffering. And I think it's really hard for families and caregivers to watch this. And so I've had many a situation where somebody might be dying in the hospital and they haven't died and it's been a week on comfort care. And the family is just thinking, when is it going to happen? It's so hard to watch him die this way and not be at peace. And then there are people who come to clinic who are dying of, let's say, end-stage emphysema, and they are also slowly dying, and it's agonizing for the people around them to watch. Because for many of my patients, they have a sense of who they are, portrait, right? I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a lover, I'm a teacher, I love gardening, I have 3 dogs. I love animals. I want to play with them as much as I can. And that identity of who you are and who makes you who you are in the world, that's what starts for many people to crumble as they get sicker and sicker, because they can't garden as much. They can't play with their dogs. They sleep more. They eat less. And that, I think, is a really hard thing to go through when you have a disease that kind of goes slowly and unpredictably. And I think the theme of what I do a lot of is uncertainty, right? So people will ask me, how long is this going to go on? And I can give them a prognosis based on the science that I know, but I can't promise them that this will be over in 2 weeks. And that's where I think having laws like physician assisted death in the US, we don't have euthanasia, but we do have this process where somebody can say, I do not wish to live this way anymore. And they go through a process. They have to be hospice eligible. So we have to think they're in the very last stages of life, and that they can still swallow pills and administer the medicines themselves and are psychologically okay. And they can end their life on their own terms. And I think that that has become more of a conversation in the palliative care world and in the world in general.
So this brings me to your book and to the title of your book, The 11th Hour. I know there's not, so where does the 11th hour, what's the significance of the 11th hour?
So I think kind of poetically, the 11th hour is kind of the winding down of life. And the reason I put that in the title is because so much of my experience has been that because of the misunderstanding of palliative care, patients get referred to me quite late in the game. And so that is part of the struggle of practicing palliative care, is that you are walking into an intense situation that is only, it's the most magnified level of intensity possible because we are in a place where the end is very near. And my hope is that, one day I can write an essay that's life and medicine in the first hour of illness, seeing people when they first get sick. And that's actually a recommendation of the American Society of Clinical Oncology and the American Heart Association. They say things like, when you get a serious diagnosis, that's when you should start seeing palliative care. Not because we're not going to treat you, but because part of treating you means attending to your suffering, and these are the specialists who can do it. And so I'll often say to people, when you say you want everything done, palliative care is part of having everything done. Or when you say you want everything done, having these hard conversations is part of doing everything for you. And I think that, moving forward, I really hope that we start to embrace this idea. There's a very important study from the New England Journal of Medicine about 10 years ago, where researchers at Mass General took 151 patients, 150, and divided them into two groups. They all had a new diagnosis of metastatic, so end stage lung cancer, and none of them had been treated yet. So half of the group got standard cancer care. Some of that sometimes included palliative care if the oncologist wanted to refer. But the other group got palliative care from the beginning, right alongside cancer treatments. And not only did they live longer, they lived better, with better scores on their symptoms and their anxiety and depression and all of that. So that study alone, which is a huge study in our field, kind of demonstrates that people think palliative care should only be relegated to the end. But the truth is, we don't know when the end is coming. And so better to be there from the beginning, getting to know somebody, getting to know their goals and values, having the intimacy of treating their suffering. And then as we get towards the end, we have the sort of relationship where we can really go into the hardest places with them. And that, I think, only consulting us at the end is a really hard emotional place to put a palliative care team as well. And I think as we move forward as a field, one thing I really hope for is that we can help our colleagues understand that better. I think we're in a moment, at least in the US, where we're talking a lot about physician burnout and physician suffering. But some of the suffering that comes in practicing palliative care comes from the ignorance around us. And some of that is a very innocent ignorance that people just weren't trained this way, don't know how to interact with a palliative care team. And I think it's our responsibility to advocate for our field by saying, this is what we do. I've often had people come and sit in meetings with me so they see what I do and aren't afraid of it. And I think that's part of what it means for our field to move away from the 11th hour, is teaching our colleagues, teaching the public, but advocating also for what's right and what has been proven through that study and others to be right for the patients.
And as you wrote your book and as you went through, the whole process of writing that book, was it as an experience about, I'm presuming you revisited a lot of things that possibly from your past, from different experiences. How was that revisiting that through your writing?
It was actually it was both amazing and very sad at times, because some of the parts of the book are not just about the patients, but about my own suffering in certain sections. And so it was a very vulnerable experience. And there were times where I couldn't stop writing because a certain patient or situation had really they imprinted into my brain like a handprint that never went away. And getting to go back there in some of these situations and really understand what they meant and why they stuck with me and why it was important for someone other than me to read about that, that was actually a really fulfilling, amazing process. I think that writing, though, is it's kind of an affliction. You want to tell the story and you're compelled to do it, but the actual process is so hard. And sometimes, even now, I sit at my desk and sentences aren't coming even when I'm forcing them to. And so I just go on Google and read about predictions for how Better Call Saul is going to end. So it's a very dynamic Better Call Saul is such an incredible show and excellent writing. So, but that aside, it's a process of really wanting to be able to understand what happened. And that too comes in waves where I can write something and say, I can't go there right now. And then I come back later and I say, okay, now I'm going to go there because I have to go there because something is leading me there. And so it's very much a spiritual process too, about allowing yourself to feel the magnitude of something that's staying with you for a reason you need to understand more deeply.
And Sunita, is your book can it be bought in Spanish? Has it been translated into Spanish?
It has not been translated into Spanish yet, but I would love that.
Well, that would be very important as well for not only for the Spanish population in Spain, but also the huge amount of Latin American and South American people living in the States and throughout the world.
Yep, absolutely. I think that would be a dream. I'm still waiting for someone to translate it into Hindi as well.
Oh, really?
I would love for, my homeland, some people who speak, and not everybody speaks Hindi in India. There's 26 different languages, but it would just be very meaningful. And I have spoken Spanish since I was in 7th grade. And so the culture and the way things are conveyed in Spanish is so beautiful and nuanced. And I think when I am with patients that don't speak English, some of the art of helping people to understand what palliative care is really trying to translate things in a way that makes sense. So, for example, I've had patients who I speak to in Spanish who I ask things like, what would you want for yourself? And that's a very new question for them because the culture of medicine where they may have immigrated from does not ask those questions. And that, I think, is a big part of what it means to help palliative care spread around the world in different countries, is understanding that it is a very kind of Anglo-centric set of questions. And so what it means to help people understand what we're asking is a process. And I've come across interpreters in different languages who don't know how to ask these questions. And I don't blame them, because these are not questions and concepts that exist in every culture. Some people come from countries where the doctor says, this is what we're going to do, and they do it, or the doctor says it's time to go home and be with your family, and that's understood as there's quote unquote nothing more we can do. And so part of the art of this field is also, how do we reach people for whom these concepts are completely foreign, or for whom the concept of autonomy is foreign?
I totally agree. And I think that it's a very lovely way to finish this time with you, very precious, is what would you want for yourself? And I think that that's so vital in all of these conversations, and so basic. It's a very basic need. And I think another basic need is, as you say, to get your book translated into Spanish so you can actually read it. And how beautiful is, as you say, if your homeland can also read your words, and for your mum and dad as well, I presume they would be so proud as well.
Oh, and I think really, I think of palliative care as a sort of birthing process to another place. And so we as healthcare professionals have an obligation to help people really understand what they're going through, so that they can make the decisions that will take them where their soul is going to go next. And it's an approach that I think every healthcare provider needs to understand and take a stab at. And I can't emphasize enough how many benefits a palliative care team has for patients and for other people in the hospital who are witnessing these tough situations and not knowing how to navigate them. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm so grateful you asked me to be a part of this.
Thank you so much, Sunita, honestly, and thank you for bringing the thread to this weaving evening that we've had, where we finished talking about people's souls and how important it is to cherish, to look after, and to be kind to ourselves and to those around us. So thank you so much for being with us. We look forward to finding somebody to translate your book into Spanish. That will be our next thing. And we hope that someday you'll be able to cross the water and come here and visit us in the Basque region, or in Spain, or in the islands, or wherever.
I would so love that. Thank you so much. And to the audience listening, thank you for being here. I think the first step to creating this type of change in our lives and in the practice of medicine is that people show up. And so thank you for being brave enough to show up to a conference like this and really think about some issues that all of us would feel more comfortable not thinking about.